Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Professor Naomi Sokoloff of the University of Washington, where I serve on the faculty of the Near East Department and the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies and Comparative Literature. It's my privilege today to introduce our speaker, David Stern, who will be giving a talk called The History of a Page, reflecting on the Talmud as a physical book, and what I've learned since my Stroum Lecture 23 years ago. So let me say just a few words before we begin about the Stroum Lectures. The Stroum Lectures were conceived over 40 years ago. At that time, the executive director of the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, Murray Schiff, decided that he wanted to bring leading scholars in Jewish studies to the Pacific Northwest. Samuel Stroum and his wife Althea agreed to fund an annual lecture series that would put the UW and the Puget Sound on the map. Speakers have included such intellectuals as Irving Howe, Stephen Zipperstein, Aaron Rodrigue, and recently, Marina Rustow. The lectures also come with a book deal. The University of Washington Press has published many volumes in the Stroum Lecture series that have advanced our knowledge and understanding of Jewish history, literature, philosophy, and memory. They include Yosef Yerushalmi's classic work, Zahor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, as well as Paula Hyman's Gender and Assimilation, the Roles and Representation of Women in Modern Jewish History. Such books have greatly advanced the field of Jewish studies. So now, in the midst of the challenging COVID-19 pandemic, we're doing something new. Today, one of our favorite former Stroum lecturers, David Stern, will reflect upon his time in Seattle back in 1997. David Stern, whom we're delighted to welcome back for this first ever digital Stroum Lecture event, is the Harry Starr Professor of Classical and Modern Hebrew and Jewish Literature in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. He's also a professor in the Comparative Literature Department there, and he is director of Harvard's Center for Jewish Studies. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of 14 books, including Parables in Midrash, Narrative and Exegesis in Rabbinic Literature, Rabbinic Fantasies, Imaginative Narratives from Classical Hebrew Literature, the Jewish Bible, A Material History, which was published by the University of Washington Press in 2017. And this book, I must mention, received the 2018 Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association for Jewish Studies in the category of Jews and the Arts. His most recent book is Jewish Literary Cultures II, the Medieval and Early Modern Periods. It's the second in a series of 3 volumes of Stern's selected essays. He's currently working on a book tentatively entitled An Unsystematic History of the Jewish Book. And his talk today will last approximately 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. You should have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, so you can send in questions throughout the talk, and then we'll gather those, and at the end of Professor Stern's address, then we can open things up for discussion. So I hope all of you now at home are giving David Stern a warm welcome, and I'll turn it over to him.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Naomi, for the very warm introduction. It's an enormous pleasure for me to be here today, even remotely, and a great honor to have been invited back to give a Stroum lecture a second time. Out of curiosity, how many of you were here at the first lectures? This is a poll question, and you can answer yes or no. And if you were here, how many of you even remember any of my lectures? I'm actually counting on the hope that you won't remember any of them at all. If you do, you'll see how little I've changed in the last 23 years. I'm waiting to see the answers, but, well, they haven't come yet. I've aged a little bit, but that's it. Seriously, the invitation to give the Stroum lectures 23 years ago was not only an enormous honor, it was already then recognized as the most prestigious lecture in Jewish studies in America, largely thanks to Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's acclaimed lectures that were later published as the book Zahor that Naomi mentioned. But for me personally, it was a turning point in my career as a scholar. Up until the time I gave the lectures, I was primarily a scholar of rabbinic literature, specifically Midrash. And when Hillel Kival and Marty Jaffe, the two University of Washington professors of Jewish studies at the time, who invited me, and to whom I'm eternally grateful for doing so, they doubtless expected me to lecture on Midrash. But instead, I decided to lecture on a different topic: the history of the Jewish book as a material object, as a physical book, as the book that Jews have actually held in their hands, studied, and read. This was a subject in which I had only recently become interested. And looking back now, I'm astonished I had the chutzpah to give 3 lectures on a subject I had only begun to study. But that was precisely what was so important about the Stroum lectures for me. They forced me to immerse myself in this new field and to learn an enormous amount in a relatively short period. And since then, I've continued my education working primarily in the history of the Jewish book. So when the invitation came to give this deja vu Stroum lecture, I decided that it would be fun to revisit the very first lecture I gave 23 years ago and to share with you what I've learned over those 23 years. The first lecture was on the Talmud, so tonight I decided to speak on the Talmud as well. The 2 other books I spoke about then were besides the Talmud, were the prayer book, the Siddur and Machzor, and the Passover Haggadah. The one book I did not speak about was the Bible. But after the lectures, when I sat down to write the book based on the lectures, as Naomi mentioned, there's a book contract connected to the lectures, I realized I couldn't write on the Jewish book without writing about the Bible. Unhappily, the chapter on the Bible, and in this book I planned, each book was supposed to be 1 chapter, but the chapter on the Bible became its own book. And that book took me 15 years to write and was finally published 2 years ago by the University of Washington Press as The Jewish Bible, The Material History of a Book. How many of you have seen the UW Press book? Anybody? Well, if you have it, you can still have a chance to buy it. Well, happily, writing the Bible book taught me an enormous amount about all the other books I was working on. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. And specifically, what I've learned in the last 23 years about the Talmud as a physical book and about this page in particular. This is the first page of the tractate Brachot, Blessings, which is by convention the very first page of the Babylonian Talmud. To some of you, I'm sure this page is very familiar. To others, it may not be. How many of you have seen this page or are familiar with it? Well, even if you are familiar with this page, I want you to look at it for a second purely as a visual image. What does it look like to you? Well, to different people, it will evoke different associations depending on how they look at the page. If you concentrate on the black blocks of text, it may remind you of a jigsaw puzzle. On the other hand, if you focus on the empty crevices between the blocks of text, it may appear like a labyrinth. Both responses invoke the enigmatic, riddling qualities often associated with the Talmud and its reputation for difficulty and often tortuously complicated arguments. Some people have told me that the page looks to them like a closed door in a wall, a very unfriendly image of otherness, which may help to explain why, when Jewish books have been burned, sometimes one suspects in place of Jews themselves, it has been the Talmud of all Jewish books that has most often been set aflame. But to those within Jewish tradition and with the linguistic skills and training to read the page, the Talmud's layout evokes a completely different set of associations. Next slide, please. On this page, I've diagrammed the contents of the page. As you can see from the diagram, the block in the center is the text of the Talmud itself. Its core, the Mishnah, is a classical law code of early rabbinic Judaism, edited in the land of Israel, Roman Palestine in 220 CE or around then. And then that's followed beneath it by the Gemara, the bulk of the Talmud, which consists of the discussions of the rabbis presented in the form of a commentary on the Mishnah, as such a discussion might have been held in the great Babylonian yeshivot between the 3rd and 5th centuries. The Gemara first began to be edited around the year 500 in Babylonia. Surrounding the core text are various commentaries. First and foremost, on the right-hand or inner side of the page, the commentary of Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, composed in northern France in the 11th century. Then on the opposite side of the core text, the glosses of the Tosafos, Rashi's grandsons, he had no sons, and disciples who lived in the subsequent 2 centuries in northern France and Germany. The Tosafos often engaged in a kind of Oedipal battle with their grandfather and teacher, challenging his interpretations and proposing alternatives, not to mention arguing among themselves. And we'll return to this point later on. And then, in the outermost farthest margins, there are the glosses and comments of still other rabbis. On the bottom, Nisim ben Jacob from Kairouan in Tunisia from the 11th century. And on the sides, cross-references to Maimonides, the great 12th century Spanish sage, and to other medieval law codes of the 14th and 16th centuries, and the textual emendations of Joel Sirkis of 16th, 17th century Poland, and the glosses of Akiva Eger from Posen, Poland, or Prussia, depending when, in the 18th century. Now, taken together, the texts on this page reflect a conversation unconstrained by time and place between sages and rabbis who have lived everywhere in the Jewish diaspora over the last 1,500 years. To the student of the Talmud who is a participant in this conversation, this page, rather than looking like a puzzle or a labyrinth or a closed door, will appear more like a vast ocean of learning, literally the sea of Talmud, with a text in the middle like an island awash in an ocean of commentary. And in fact, this is how the Talmud is traditionally known, as Yam HaTalmud, literally the sea of Talmud, into which the avid and intrepid student dives and then swims for his or her life. Now, except for the ornate initial word panel at the top of the central column, this page's page format, layout, is also the typical format for most pages in the Talmud. This page is the final literary crystallization of what is known in classical Judaism as the oral law, or Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, a term that designates the entirety of classical Jewish exegetical, legal, narrative, and homiletical tradition. This oral Torah was originally an orally composed and transmitted text, and it came into existence between the 2nd and 6th century CE. The Babylonian Talmud, one of 2 versions of the Talmud, was compiled in present-day Iraq sometime after the 6th century and existed as a completed written document no later than the late 8th or early 9th century. The page on the screen is from the last great printing of the Talmud by the Vilna publishing house of the widow of Ram and his brothers, printed between 1880 and 1886. Nearly all editions of the Talmud since then have been photocopies of the Ram edition. The Babylonian Talmud is a work of some 2.5 million words. In its first printed edition, published by the Christian printer Daniel Bomberg in Venice between 1520 and 1523, the complete Babylonian Talmud filled nearly 3,000 folios, or 6,000 pages. A folio is a leaf. Each page is each side of a folio. In some 63 tractates, each page following this basic layout, though differing in its specific configuration. Nor was this page layout an invention of print. It was already used in the manuscript age, as you can see from this page, from a manuscript written in Spain in the year 1440. Now, this page format is also arguably the iconic visual image in classical Jewish literary culture. Virtually every text in classical Jewish literature that has aspired to the prestige and the authority of the Babylonian Talmud has at one time or another adapted this page format. Most obviously, there's the Bible, to which I'll return shortly, but here are a few other less obvious works that have adopted the page format. Maimonides' great law code, the Mishnah Torah, which Maimonides himself hoped would replace the Talmud as the final word in Jewish law. The Passover Haggadah, the mystical, very un-Talmudic, classic mystical work, Sefer HaBahir. Nor is this list of Talmud-aspiring works limited to classical Jewish literature. Here's a book by a contemporary Jewish theologian, Emory Professor David Blumenthal, that wishes to claim for itself Talmudic authority. Obviously, the page layout here does not guarantee the message. And finally, here is a page from the English translation of a Hebrew novel by contemporary American-Israeli novelist Ruby Namdar, with his fiction actually surrounded by Talmudic passages. Now, in this lecture today, I want to explore the history of this iconic page format. Where did it come from? And then speak about its impact upon the study of Talmud. Now, the subtitle of my talk, Reflecting on the Talmud, has the additional question, statement in parentheses, and what I've learned over the last 23 years. Well, here's what I've learned. In my original lecture, I knew the basic answer to the question of the origins of this page, and I'm going to tell you that answer shortly. But what I didn't know were its details, nor did I understand why it was and remains so important. Now I understand both much better. As we'll see, a book's material features, whether the book is in the form of a scroll or what scholars call a codex, and most other people call a book, or a book's page layout, or whether there are illustrations or decorations on the page. All these physical features of the book, not to mention its size and shape, can have a determinative impact on how we read a book and understand its meaning. We do not read texts. Texts are simply words, and until they're inscribed, put in writing, words are merely abstractions in the mind. What we read are texts that have been inscribed with on some sort of physical surface, and the material nature of that inscription can make all the difference in the world to how we interpret and understand the text. Furthermore, it's a historical fact that the physical shape of the Jewish book always reflects the physical shapes of the books of the majority culture in which the Jews producing their books have lived and continue to live. And because of this fact, the materiality of the Jewish book is the interface between the Hebrew text and the world. This, in short, is what I've learned in the last 23 years. And with that in mind, let us now return to the Talmudic page. We saw earlier that the page layout of the Talmud goes back to the manuscript age, this page, which was written in Spain in 1440. Jewish scribes did not, however, invent the page format. And here's the answer to my question, where did the page format come from? The Talmudic page derives its format from the Glossa Ordinaria, the glossed Christian Bible as it initially developed in northern France from the early 20th century until the mid-13th. How many of you have seen this page? Well, the invention of the Glossa Ordinaria, both its text and its page format, is usually attributed to Anselm of Laon, the master of the Cathedral School of Laon and one of the great teachers of the early 12th century. In fact, Anselm himself was not the first to use this format. It had been used earlier for some classical texts, but he was the first to exploit it for the purposes of teaching scripture. Scholars have studied and tracked the development of the closest format, and they've identified two basic forms for the page, which appear to have developed chronologically in stages. The image on the screen is an example of the page format in a manuscript from the mid-12th century. The page consists, as you can see, of 3 columns of unequal width. The central column contains the Vulgate, written in a larger script and lines spaced generously enough so that there is room between them for brief interlinear comments that typically offer shorthand allegorical identifications and abbreviated interpretations. On both sides of the Vulgate column are 2 wider columns dedicated to the gloss itself, which consists of lengthier explanatory and homiletical comments culled from church fathers like Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine, and from early medieval exegetes like Rabanus Maurus, with an occasional gloss by the compiler himself. Each of these glosses is a separate unit of its own, keyed by one symbol or another to a verse or phrase or word in the Vulgate text. The glosses are placed as close as possible to the specific text they comment on. It does not seem to have mattered whether the note was on the right or the left column. And as you can see, if there was no gloss on a passage, the space in the side column was left empty, which wasn't ideal since parchment space is expensive to rent. Most copies of the glossa before 1170 share this format. After the year 1170, a more complex variation of this page developed. In this format, the columns no longer remain static shapes, but become dynamic entities on the page, with the middle text column invading one of the glossa columns or the reverse. The main rationale for this change was probably the scribe's desire to use up all the available space on the page, but there may have been an aesthetic motive as well. In either case, the new format involved a crucial change in scribal practice and how the scribe actually wrote the manuscript. In the simpler form that we saw a second ago, he wrote the middle biblical column on each page through the entirety of the manuscript, and then he went back and added the glosses to the 2 side columns. But in the case of this more dynamic page, the scribe had to write all 3 columns simultaneously. In fact, this is the very cause behind the format's dynamism. When the scribe saw that he didn't have enough gloss to fill the right or left column, which he must have been writing at the same time as the middle columns, he extended that middle column into either the right or left margins of the writing grid, or vice versa, until the balance between the core text, the Vulgate, and the secondary text, the glossa, resumed, and then he returned to the original design of parallel columns. Obviously, this format was a much more challenging one for a scribe to take up, because he essentially had to prophesy the correct proportion of text to commentary before he could see them on the page. Anselm created the glossa ordinaria as a genre and as a format to serve as a teaching tool. The great innovation of the glossa in the history of medieval Christian education was to place both scripture and commentary literally on the same page, and thus to restore scripture to its place as the primary subject of education. Before Anselm, students studied commentaries, which told them what scripture meant. They didn't study scripture. But with scripture placed in the center column on Anselm's page and inscribed in a larger, more prominent hand, the teacher now could move from expounding the Bible's own literal sense before getting to the encompassing spiritual meanings taught by the church father in addition to the Bible's own literal sense. The early format of the glossa on the left here was designed specifically so that the teacher could easily locate the gloss while teaching the scriptural text. The written page was meant to facilitate oral performance. In contrast, the dynamic page, which you see on the right with its complex intersecting columns and blocks of text, is too complicated to teach from and better suited to private reading and consultation as a reference work. And it was in this role that in the late 12th and 13th century, the glossa spread throughout Europe, out of the cathedral schools and into monasteries and universities. The Jewish historians Colette Sirat and Joseph Schatzmiller have outlined the social and financial routes through which Jewish scribes first became aware of the glossed page format. On the basis of a census of Latin manuscripts with Hebrew inscription, Sirat has proposed that Jewish moneylenders took these Latin manuscripts as collateral for loans. The moneylenders, many of whom were sages and scribes, being a moneylender actually is a great job for a rabbi because it leaves you lots of time to study, and many of these rabbis were also scribes. They certainly looked at the books once they were in their possession, and even if they could not read the Latin, they would have seen their layout, which they then adapted to their own books. The first Jewish books to use the format appear to have been Bibles. Next slide, please. This image shows a Pentateuch composed in France in the early 13th century with one of our earliest testimonies to Rashi's original commentary. The basic 3-column format has been retained, but with variations. The middle column, the biblical text in large vocalized square letters, is wider than either of the side columns, the opposite to what we saw in the Glossa Ordinaria. The inner column contains the Targum, the Aramaic translation, the outer column, Rashi's commentary, and the mini columns at the bottom of the page contain Masoretic notes. This is the corpus of annotations on the Bible. Now, this page, when you look at it, is a very orderly page, but compare that page to this page from a volume of First Prophets written in Segovia at the end of the 15th century. This is a kind of deconstructed, almost cubist rendering of the glossa format, though it still maintains the rudiments of the 3 columns. So here in the center, you have the scripture column, and then here you have one of the side columns, and here you have the other side column. But it's like a cubist deconstructed page. The page contains 5 separate units: the biblical text, the Aramaic Targum, and then 3 commentaries: Rashi, David Kimchi, and Levi ben Gershom, or Gersonides. And the scribe has differentiated the different commentaries for the reader by placing each one in its own asymmetrical geometric shape in a different script size and in a different script and size and in a different ink or color. These multi-text pages show how scribes exercise their virtuosity. No 2 pages of these codices are alike. Each one testifies to its scribe's individuality. But note the difference between the format of these pages and that of the glossa. As we've seen, the glossa is a compendium of patristic and early medieval commentaries compressed into individual notes on scriptural proof texts. It's a kind of summa of earlier Christian exegesis. While there are shorter and lengthier versions of the glossa, each is a coherent document on its own, and the format with its 3 columns is a coherent format. There is no parallel to the glossa in medieval Jewish exegesis, no attempt to summarize and present a single authoritative Jewish interpretation of the Bible. As this page testifies, the page you see before you, Jewish exegetical tradition is not coherent. Each interpreter maintains his individuality, his separateness on the page. The reader of this page does not emerge with an understanding of the correct or authoritative interpretation of the Bible, but with a sense of the multiplicity of its interpretations and their jagged differences. The separate elements on these pages may seem to fit together like the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but their irregular, discordant shapes actually have the effect of forcing the reader to compare, contrast, and recognize the disparities between the various commentaries, each of which has its own unmistakable shape that will never be confused with another's. This is not a page that invites harmonization, but the acknowledgement of irreconcilable differences. Now, in the case of the Talmud, the adaptation of the glossa format took a somewhat different direction. The first thing to note about the history of the Talmud as a book is how few complete manuscripts of the Talmud survive from the Middle Ages, a total of 63 in all. Now, there must once have existed numerous more copies, since the Talmud was the basis of the Jewish educational curriculum. But the primary reason for their disappearance, or the disappearance of most of these copies, is not that they were burned or destroyed by Gentiles. It's because they were studied to death by Jews until the letters literally fell off the pages and the pages themselves fell apart or began to disintegrate. Most of the surviving volumes that we have are either single tractates or orders of the Talmud. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were essentially three different formats used to transcribe the Talmud, to write it down. The first two consist of the Talmudic text alone, either in a double column format, like you see here on this page opening, or in a single page-wide column. And you should note, in the case of both those pages, the notes in the margins are later editions of private readers. They're not commentaries. Generally, in the medieval world, commentaries were written in separate books called kuntrasim. This is the reason why, for example, the Tosafos often refer to Rashi as the kuntras, because he was written in his own little separate book. Now, there is also one unique Talmud codex, a volume known to scholars as Codex Munich 95. As I said before, in the Middle Ages in general, only single tractates of the Talmud, the tractates studied in the yeshivot, were copied. Munich 95 is the sole surviving single codex containing the entire Talmud within its covers. And it probably was one of only perhaps two such volumes copied in the entire medieval period, almost certainly as a kind of definitive Talmud edition written in a single volume as a symbolic gesture to demonstrate the unity of the entire Talmudic corpus, that it was all really one book. The page format of this codex anticipates the layout of the gloss page, but as you can see, there are no commentaries on this page, only the Mishnah and the Gemara, the two core texts of the Talmud. The Mishnah is written in the inner block in large square letters, like the letters you find in a Torah scroll, while the Gemara is written in a smaller semi-cursive hand, a script usually used for a commentary, which is what the Gemara pretends to be for the Mishnah. But there is no real commentary on the page, no Rashi or Tosafot. And then finally, we come to the third and least common page format, the true glossed page with commentaries. Today, there exist only 3 examples of this format with multiple commentaries on the page, and we'll look at all 3. This page is from the earliest surviving manuscript to preserve the format, a codex written in Arras in northern France in the second half of the 14th century. This manuscript essentially replicates the 3-column format of the simple glossed page, but in this case, there are 2 different commentaries on the page. In the innermost column, the commentary of Rashi, the northern French sage whose commentary became in the Middle Ages the indispensable companion to the Talmudic text. And on the other side, the novellae of the Tosafos, who I talked about before, and they engage in constant scholastic warfare with their grandfather and teacher. The glossed Christian page first emerged in northern France, and the early Tosafos also lived in northern France, and it seems likely that this glossed page format may first have emerged within the Tosafos circles to reflect the way that Talmud was in fact studied in their Talmudic academies. Now, the Arras page represents the glossed Talmud page in its simplest form. This page, from an early 15th century North Italian Talmud, begins to resemble the more complex and dynamic glossed page, albeit with 4 columns on the page. And finally, here is our Spanish page, the Talmudic page almost as we know it in its printed form. On this page, the columns virtually wrap around each other, creating what looks like a very harmonious image, or an image that invites harmonization. As I mentioned earlier, this page format is a difficult one for a scribe to write because he must virtually prophesy the right amount of text and commentary in order to get it all on the same page without wasting precious parchment space. And this same page also shows you what happens when a scribe messes up. The poor guy had to write the last lines of the Tosafot along the inside margin, climbing up the side of the side column like a gecko on a windowsill because he didn't have enough room at the bottom of the page. Now, even though the glossed page was the rarest of all the medieval formats, it was nonetheless a page format that early Italian Jewish printers adapted for the Talmud. This is the first page of the first tractate of the Talmud to be printed by the great Jewish printer Joshua Solomon Sanchino in 1483-84. Why did Sanchino choose this page format? There's probably 3 reasons. First, It was obviously very marketable to produce a Talmud with all the commentaries on the same page rather than in separate books. Second, it was much easier for printers to produce this page format than it had been for scribes, because printers could prepare a model book in which they could plot out each page and get the correct proportions, and then print a run of, say, 200 copies. And third, Sanshina was probably familiar with this page format because he came from a family of German Tosafists, and he may have grown up studying the Talmud himself from such a manuscript page. After Sanshino, other early printers of the Talmud adopted the page format, and most importantly, the great Christian printer of Hebrew books, Daniel Bomberg, in his first edition of the complete Talmud that he published between 1520 and 1523. Bomberg built upon his predecessors, but he prepared his own model books for the entire Talmud, and for the first time in history, he foliated the entire Talmud. That is, he numbered its folio pages, and thereby he effectively set the Talmudic page in stone forever. Virtually every edition since Bomberg has followed his page layout, beginning and ending each page with the same word. Bomberg invested a lot of money in preparing his model books, and after him, no one wanted to invest the money a second time. It was much more economical simply to follow Bomberg's foliation. Thus, his pages, the pages of this Christian printer, became the definitive Talmudic page. Unlike Hebrew study Bibles using the Glossa-derived format, each of which is basically different in format, even in printed editions, there is only a single page format for the Babylonian Talmud. And finally, here is the Widow Ram's page where we began, and which itself is based on Bomberg's page. What was the impact of this page format upon the study of Talmud? To answer this question, it may be helpful again to compare it to the glossa, whether in its more simple or more dynamic shapes. As we saw, the right and left columns on either side of the Vulgate text, along with the interlinear glosses, are all part of the same composition, the glossa ordinaria. The page represents a passage of scripture with its coherent standard meaning arrayed in a commentary on its two sides. Both sides are in agreement inasmuch as they're part of the same work. In contrast, the columns on the two sides of the Talmudic text, Rashi on the right and the Tosafos on the left, are, if not in actual war with each other, then engaged in constant scholastic battles and intellectual combat. The page, in other words, is a battlefield, and this determines how the page is read. The student of the Talmud begins with the core text in the middle, then he or she moves to the Rashi on the right, then he or she skips over the core text of the Tosafot on the left side, then attempts to resolve the disagreements between the two commentators, or at least understand the basis of their disagreement, and then finally returns to the core text with the skills and understanding he or she has acquired in the course of their journey across the columns of the page. And in provoking this reading experience, the page format goes from being, in the words of Joanna Drucker, a representation of knowledge to becoming a generator of knowledge. In the Middle Ages, there were two different ways of studying the Talmud, each of which was premised upon a somewhat different understanding of the work. The first way, which was dominant in Sfarad, Iberia, until the beginning of the 14th century, viewed the Talmud primarily as a source of law. Its complex and intricate analyses were treated as a preface to the adjudication of the law. And that is how codifiers like Maimonides studied the Talmud, as source material for their codes. The second way was dominant in Ashkenaz, where the Talmud was studied precisely for its intricate and convoluted analyses, as scholastic exercises in discovering and resolving contradictions, which is how the Tosafists, the authors of the Tosafot, studied the text. Now, both conceptions of the Talmud's significance can be found in the Talmud. It can be read either as a source for the law or as an exercise in scholastic argument. And it was, in fact, studied both ways in the two different centers. But the Talmudic page format derived from the glossa privileges the dialogical scholastic dimension of the Talmud. Or better yet, it brings that side to the surface and makes it visible on the page. The very type of reading that the page mandates, where one column debates its opposite on the other side of the core text, reenacts the dialogical element implicit in the Talmudic text, which, as I said before, presents itself as a kind of unedited transcript of a study session among sages, each of whom typically disputes or challenges his colleague and their interpretation of the law. And thanks to this page format, it is this image of the Talmud of dialectical argument, that has won out historically. Now, the glossed page is a technology. It's a technology like the digital page, like Zoom. It allows its users, its producers and readers to do things with it they could not otherwise, they could otherwise not do. But what they end up doing with the technology is not dictated by the technology itself. It's determined by its human users. The technology of the gloss page is a dramatic example of this fact, which should be of interest to anyone interested in the humanities today, in the place of the humanities in our world of technology, and what the humanities can teach us. Technology is a tool, not an end. The end is determined by its human use. And that is what the humanities can reveal and teach us. And that's what it shows us in the case of the glossed page as an example of technology. We can see what its human users did with it. In the hands of Anselm of Laon and his successors, the authors of the Glossa Ordinaria, the glossed page was a technology for presenting scripture with a single standard commentary explaining its authoritative Christian meaning. In the case of the Rabbinic Bible with multiple commentaries, the gloss page was a format for demonstrating the multiplicities of Scripture's meanings, its richness and possibilities for different types of meaningfulness. And in the case of the Talmud, the gloss page was turned into a gladiatorial arena for rabbinic sages to wrestle with each other and extract every dialectical twist and turn buried in the text on the page. The same technology, three different uses. Jews may have borrowed this technology of the gloss page from Christian sources, but in their hands, they transformed it, doubly, in fact, as we've seen. And thereby, they also Judaized it. Anselm would probably be turning over in his grave if he could see a page of Talmud. On the other hand, no matter how ironic it may seem to us, the very fact of the Christian origins of the Talmudic page's layout, along with the complementary fact that the shape of the printed page was set in stone by a Christian printer, Daniel Bomberg, is only one indication of how deeply situated and implicated the Talmud, that most insular of all Jewish books, is in Western culture and all its unlikely contingencies. Within the time limits of this talk, I can't talk more about the history of the later impact of the gloss page on Talmud study. I will say only that it was critical for the development and shaping of the intensive form of dialectical study called Pilpul that developed in the 16th and 17th centuries. This form of study concentrated on the contradictions found on the Talmudic page itself, and especially between the Rashi and Tosafot on a specific page. It was also during this period that the form of study known as study b'chavruta, in pairs, emerged as a normative way of studying Talmud, in which two students recite the Talmudic passage to each other and reenact aloud the dialogue implicit in the Talmudic text itself. A 16th century description of Pilpul describes the sound of a multitude of pairs of students in a yeshiva studying b'chavruta as being as loud as the, I quote, the noise of mighty waters. The Talmud began as an orally transmitted text, but the more written and then printed, fixed that text became, the more insistently oral, vocal, and vociferous, noisy, became its mode of study. One cannot hear that noise of debating students on the Talmudic page, but one can see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to clap. I don't know if anybody else is clapping, but I am.
Thank you.
Some questions for you. There's some questions here about historical development that I thought were quite important. Why did Bomberg pursue his massive undertaking? What was his motivation?
Pardon me? What? Why did Bomberg print the?
Yeah, why did he do it? What was his motivation?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. There were basically two motivations. First, and this is the less important motivation, I think, it was a very lucrative, the Talmud was very lucrative to publish. And Hebrew books were actually quite lucrative to publish because Jews bought them. But not only Jews bought Hebrew books and classical Jewish texts in particular in the early 16th century. Bomberg himself was a Christian Hebraist. Christian Hebraism was a movement that began in the Middle Ages, but actually really gained force in the 15th and 16th centuries. Christian Hebraists believed that the secrets of Christianity were actually buried in classical Jewish texts, in the Bible as it was, received in Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, in Aramaic texts, and especially in the Kabbalah, but that they had these secrets of Christianity had basically been hidden in these texts by the rabbis who did not want them to be revealed, because if they were revealed, Jews would see them and they would convert to Christianity. So that Christian Hebraists were very interested in learning Hebrew, studying Jewish texts, so that they could discover these secrets, reveal them to Jews, and thereby convert the Jews. So that was actually, I think, the deeper motivation behind Bomberg's interest in publishing Hebrew books, Jewish books in particular, Jewish books. But as I said, they were also very lucrative. Bomberg came from a fabulously wealthy family of merchants from Antwerp. And he's really quite a fascinating figure. And he was the greatest Jewish printer in the history of Jewish printing. And he was a great Philo-Semite, too. But he was a complicated figure. Many of the Jews, he employed Jews in his print shop. Everybody who worked for him was Jewish, but many of those Jews either already had converted or later converted to Christianity. But the reason why he was able to print a Talmud and not a Jewish printer was because he, as a Christian, was able to get a privilege from the Venetian Senate and rights from the Pope. Gershom Soncino, who was the nephew of Joshua Solomon Soncino, the great early Jewish printer, the founder of the Soncino dynasty, he wanted to print a complete edition of the Talmud in Venice, but he couldn't get a privilege because he was a Jew. Bomberg could, because he was a Christian.
So moving backward in time a little bit from Christians who were interested in Jews to anti-Semitism, what might have happened to the extraordinary 1487 Segovia page and its scribe when just 5 years later Jews were expelled from Spain?
Well, we don't know. The manuscript right now is in Moscow, in the Günzburg collection, in the Lenin Library, improbably enough. I'm not sure where it was before Baron Günzburg bought it. The Jews were expelled in 1492. Jews were writing manuscripts up until the time of their expulsion. Some of the most beautiful Sephardi manuscripts actually come from the last 50 years in Spain. You know, despite the persecutions, Judaism was still thriving in Spain at that time. And some of the greatest manuscripts, the Kennicott Bible was written during that period. That's one of the most beautiful manuscripts that exist, Hebrew manuscripts that exists. So does that answer the question?
I think so. It sounds like there's a very long, complicated history that that would be interesting to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitism did not play into it. I mean, the Christians wanted Jews to convert to Christianity. It was slightly different than, you know, anti-Semitism as we understand it today, which is just hatred of Jews.
Okay, I have a couple of questions here about the format of the page. Why is it that, just a moment, please. Could you please expand more on the different colors of the words seen in some of the pages?
Okay, well, the only one in which the colors really play a significant role is that that the deconstructed cubist Bible page. And there, unfortunately, I don't know why it is, but the vibrancy of the colors never comes out in any of the digital images. I've looked at that manuscript in person, actually twice, and it's very, very clear. You know, each unit on the page had a very different color, not only the shapes, but that's the only one in which the colors really, really figure. I mean, on other manuscript pages, sometimes, you know, certain things are in red that the scribe wants to highlight, but usually they're in the same, you know, color script, unless they're illustrated or decorated. And then in that case, they use different colors.
And could you
sometimes gold leaf.
On the fact that the Talmud starts on page Bet and not Aleph?
Okay, so the reason why the Talmud starts on page 2 on Bet is because the title page in early printed books was page 1. That's the real reason. The reason that is often cited, the Talmudic page early on itself became, that is to say, the material page became the subject of midrashic or midrash-like interpretations. So the fact that the first page of text was a Bet, page 2, was an obvious occasion for interpretation. Why number 2? Why does it start on the second page? Well, the answer is because the Talmud has no beginning. Okay, there's usually 4 lines of Rashi on the top of the page. Why does Rashi have 4 lines? Well, to teach you that you should study the Talmud 4 times in order, every passage 4 times in order to know it. And there are loads of, you know, various homilies, you know, midrash-like interpretations for little features like that on the page. The page itself became a subject of commentary.
Okay. I have a question here about halacha. How did printing Rashi and Tosafot alongside the Gemara impact the halachic process? The layout of the printed Talmud page leads the reader, even subconsciously, to understand the text of Gemara through the opinions and explanations of the surrounding commentaries on the page.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. What it did was well, before printing, Rashi was already an indispensable, you know, companion to the study of Talmud. Nobody studied Talmud without Rashi in the Middle Ages, even before print. What print did, and what, you know, first Sanchino and then Bombard did by turning the printed Talmud into the definitive Talmud, was they canonized the Tosafot, and specifically the Tosafot that they published. They only published a selection of the existing Tosafot. The Tosafot that they did not publish all fell into oblivion and were only actually rediscovered in the middle of the 20th century in manuscript. But they really raised the Tosafot to a canonical status. Moreover, for other reasons, the fact that the beginning of printing coincided with the Spanish expulsion. The Spanish expulsion disrupted printing in Iberia, in Sfarad, which previously had a very thriving Jewish publishing industry, and which published Talmuds without the Tosafot. But the expulsion disrupted Spanish printing, stopped the publishing of those Talmuds. In the meantime, Bomberg's edition took over the world market of Talmud editions. So it made the Tosafot a universal canonical part of the Talmud. And basically it made, because the Tosafot are really the exemplars of Ashkenazic tradition, scholastic tradition, it made the Talmud that people have studied since then an Ashkenazi document. So it really had, I wouldn't say that its impact upon, that there were other ways in which the Talmud impacted upon halacha that was not Ashkenazi, because Maimonides remained a real force, and they studied Maimonides. But the Talmud, because of this, and because of the place that the Tosafot actually, received, thanks to Bomberg and being on the page with Rashi, really turned the Talmud into an Ashkenazi document, and gave the importance to the Tosafot on the page that they never had a chance in the world of having without Bomberg.
I see that questions are multiplying as you talk, which is a good sign. It means that what you're saying is generating interest. I think we have time for two more.
I'm willing to go on. So, I mean.
One question is again, a technology question. What about the invention of spectacles? Did that have any impact on the way that these things were printed, or how tiny the print might be?
That's an interesting question. Not that I know, but they did have spectacles in the Middle Ages. So, I mean, the only thing, the size of script or fonts does not determine legibility. It's the clarity of the writing or the font that really has the biggest impact upon legibility, not size. So, but eyeglasses certainly kick in at some point. But I don't know anything more about that. Yes.
Okay, so to bring our conversation to a conclusion more in the present, somebody wanted to ask you to comment on the Steinsaltz reconfiguring of the DAF.
Steinsaltz. Well, Steinsaltz, well, first of all, what he's done is extraordinary. I mean, he's the first person since Rashi to write a commentary on the full Talmud. I mean, he's done even more than Rashi. Rashi didn't write on the full Talmud, nearly the full Talmud. Steinsaltz really did it on the entire Talmud. The original Steinsaltz edition appropriated the Talmudic page format. And, it kept the Hebrew, the Talmud and the Gemara in the center of the page. I don't remember if they actually did have, I don't think they had Rashi. They had his, I'm trying to remember if they actually had Rashi on the page. They definitely did not have the Tosafot. They had his commentary. The English one has a literal translation and then his explanatory commentary. And I know then they have his, sort of realia notes and pictures illustrating things, scientific notes, as it were, on the page. Now, the reason why he appropriated the Talmudic page was to give his readers the feel of studying the traditional Talmudic page. That is not the traditional Talmud. The traditional Talmud is not accessible to the people most of the people who use Steinsaltz. That's the reason why they use Steinsaltz. But they want to feel as though they're studying the traditional Talmud. Studying that page actually gives them that feeling. And that's the power of the page format. It's more powerful than the content of the page. Now, what's really interesting is that in the new edition, the Koren edition, I think that's what they call it. They no longer call it the Steinsaltz edition. They dropped that page format. And now they have a different page format, which is a bit more like the Schottenstein's format. You know, the text on the top of the page and then the commentary on the bottom of the page. I always thought that there was a lot of controversy about Steinsaltz's appropriation of the Talmudic page, but some people have told me that I'm wrong about that. There wasn't really controversy about that. There was more controversy because he was a Lubavitcher, and you know, ultra-Orthodox Jews who were very much anti-Lubavitch were against his, you know, his edition for that reason. I'm working on the Talmud chapter to actually finish this book that I should have finished 23 years ago. And that's one of the things I still have to work on, is the fate of the Steinsaltz edition. But it's a very important edition, but it really is, you know, it's one of the biggest proofs of the power of the format. You know, there the medium really is the message.
Thank you. That's probably a good place to stop. Let me just, on behalf of everybody, say thank you very much, David. It was really very interesting.
It was a real pleasure.
One more note, next year, the Stroum Center for Jewish Studies will be hosting lectures with Dr. Julia Watts-Belser of Georgetown University on the subject of reading Jewish texts in an age of climate change. If you're interested in learning more, you can visit our website, jewishstudies.washington.edu/Stroum2021 to see what our offering will be next year. Thanks very much for attending, everyone.